Montana Territory, 1887. The town of Silver Creek stood at the crossroads of wilderness and civilization, a place where the whisper of wind through pine trees mingled with the occasional piano notes drifting from the saloon. It was here that Grant Remington believed he had found his place, not among people, but on the edges of their world. At 25, he'd already decided that the frontier had no room for the softness of love or family. The West demanded vigilance and solitude. Anything else was an invitation to heartbreak or an early grave. With lean muscle built from years of ranch work, a square jaw that rarely softened with a smile, and deep-set eyes that missed nothing, Grant had crafted himself into what the frontier demanded, a man who needed no one. His light brown hair, usually hidden beneath his worn Stetson, would catch golden highlights in the sun. But few noticed such things about the quiet cowboy who worked the Carson Ranch just outside of town. What folks did notice was his skill with horses, his straight shooting, and his tendency to disappear into the mountains when not working. They'd whisper about the scar that traced his left temple, wondering what violence had marked him, but Grant never offered explanations. The few who'd tried to befriend him found a polite but impenetrable wall. He arrived at town gatherings late, left early, and spoke only when necessary. Man wasn't made to ride alone forever, old Carson had told him once as they mended fence line on the far pasture. Even the wolves pair up, son. Grant had merely tightened the wire and moved to the next post. He'd seen what love did on the frontier, watched his mother wither away waiting for a father who never returned from a cattle drive, buried by 17-year-old Grant himself when pneumonia finally took her. No, the only reliable companions were a good horse, a weathered saddle, and the wide Montana sky. Everything else was just waiting to be lost. What Grant couldn't admit, even to himself, was how the emptiness of his cabin sometimes pressed in on him during the long winter nights. How watching married couples in town stirred something beneath his carefully constructed armor. Those feelings were dangerous, weakness the frontier would exploit, so he buried them deeper with each passing season. Spring had come early to Silver Creek that year, bringing with it the usual influx of travelers, fortune-seekers, and those just passing through to Oregon or California. Grant paid them little mind as he rode into town that Saturday to pick up supplies for the ranch. The town had swelled with the warming weather, making him even more determined to complete his errands quickly and return to the solitude of the ranch. He was securing his packhorse outside the general store when the stagecoach arrived, kicking up dust that momentarily obscured his vision. When it cleared, Grant found himself involuntarily staring at the young woman descending from the coach. She couldn't have been more than 22, with honey blonde hair pinned neatly beneath a modest blue bonnet that matched her traveling dress. Unlike the weathered faces of frontier women, hers still held the softness of someone who hadn't yet been hardened by the Montana elements. Ruby Vance clutched her small valise tightly as she surveyed the dusty main street of Silver Creek. At 22 years old, she had traveled farther from her Boston home than she'd ever imagined possible, driven by a mixture of necessity and hope. Her deep blue eyes, which her father had once compared to the Atlantic at dawn, took in every detail of the frontier town. The weathered buildings, the horses tied to hitching posts, the curious glances from locals. Ruby smoothed her blue traveling dress, suddenly aware of how out of place she must appear. The journey had been long and arduous, but she had maintained her appearance as best she could. Her honey blonde hair was neatly pinned, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. She'd been raised to believe that a lady's appearance reflected her character, but the practical side of her wondered how long such niceties would last in a place where survival seemed to be the primary concern. The stagecoach driver handed down her trunk, and Ruby thanked him with the polite smile she'd perfected in Boston society. But that society had crumbled for her when her father's investments failed, and his subsequent heart attack left her alone with nothing but debts and pitying glances from former friends. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like Providence, a teaching position in Montana Territory, far from whispers and shame, a chance to rebuild. What the advertisement hadn't mentioned was the raw, unfinished nature of Silver Creek. Looking down the dusty street, Ruby felt a moment of panic. Her teaching experience at a refined girls' school in Boston seemed suddenly inadequate preparation for educating frontier children. "Miss Vance." Ruby turned to see a portly man with a magnificent mustache hurrying toward her. "Yes, I'm Ruby Vance. Mayor Hollister at your service. We're mighty pleased you've come. Our last teacher left us rather abruptly when her fiancé arrived to claim her. Been without proper schooling for our youngsters for nearly 3 months." Ruby nodded, trying to mask her apprehension. I'm looking forward to meeting my students. Is the schoolhouse nearby? The mayor's expression faltered. Well, about that, the schoolhouse is still being built. Until it's finished, we've arranged for classes to be held in the church. Simple building, but it's got benches and a small bell. Should serve well enough for now. Ruby's heart sank. No proper schoolhouse, but she maintained her composure. I see, and where will I be staying? Mrs. Wilson takes in boarders. Widow woman, very respectable. Her place is just down the street. I'll have your trunk sent over. He gestured vaguely toward a 2-story white clapboard house before checking his pocket watch. Town council meeting in 15 minutes. Perhaps you'd like to rest from your journey today and tour the church tomorrow. Before Ruby could respond, Mayor Hollister was already backing away, tipping his hat. Welcome to Silver Creek, Miss Vance. We're mighty grateful to have an educated lady such as yourself joining our community. And then he was gone, leaving Ruby standing alone with her valise, the stagecoach already departing for its next destination. She took a deep breath, fighting back a wave of homesickness. This wasn't Boston with its brick buildings and cobblestone streets. This was the frontier where everything, including her future, seemed as vast and uncertain as the Montana sky above. She became aware of someone watching her and turned to find a tall cowboy loading supplies onto a packhorse. His face was partially shadowed by his hat, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. Unlike the other men she'd seen who nodded or tipped their hats, this one simply observed, his expression unreadable. Ruby straightened her shoulders and nodded politely in his direction before picking up her valise. She would not be intimidated on her first day. This was her new beginning, and she would face it with the same determination that had carried her across the country. As she walked toward Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, Ruby couldn't help glancing back once. The cowboy had returned to his task, but there was something in his fluid movements and solitary focus that stayed with her. In a town full of strangers, he seemed somehow more foreign than the rest, a man apart. Grant watched the newcomer make her way down the street, noting the straight spine and determined stride that belied the uncertainty he'd glimpsed in her expression. Eastern, obviously, probably another bride-to-be or maybe a relative joining family. She wouldn't last long, they rarely did. The territory had ways of sending such delicate creatures back where they came from. Yet as he finished loading his supplies, Grant found himself remembering the clear blue of her eyes when she'd met his gaze unflinchingly. There had been something there beyond the expected apprehension of a newcomer, a resolve that seemed at odds with her fine clothes and gentle features. Not your concern, he muttered to himself, mounting his horse and turning toward the ranch road. By next spring she'd likely be gone, either wed to some local or returned east with her dreams of frontier adventure thoroughly shattered. Either way, Grant Remington would remain exactly as he was. Alone and untroubled by the complications that came with caring about another soul's fate. But as he rode the 5 miles back to the Carson ranch, the image of the blonde stranger standing alone in the dusty street kept returning, unwelcome and persistent. 3 days later, Grant was repairing a broken wagon wheel when Carson approached with an unusual request. Need you to deliver some lumber to town. Church needs benches for the new schoolteacher's classes. Grant looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. Peterson usually handles town deliveries. Carson nodded. He does, but he's down with that fever that's been going around. You're the only one I can spare right now. Grant wanted to refuse. Town meant people, questions, the expectation of conversation. But Carson had been good to him for 3 years, asking few questions about his past and respecting his preference for solitary work. I'll go after lunch, Grant conceded, returning to the wheel. Carson lingered. Here the new teacher's quite a looker, Boston girl, they say. Grant kept his eyes on his work, ignoring the subtle probing. Carson, like most in town, thought what Grant needed was a woman's touch to soften his hard edges. They were wrong. What he needed was exactly what he had, work that tired the body enough that the mind could rest, and enough distance from others that their inevitable loss wouldn't matter. By mid-afternoon, Grant had loaded the lumber and was driving the wagon toward town, rehearsing how to make the delivery with minimal interaction. He'd drop the lumber at the church, get the receipt signed, and be back at the ranch before sunset. Simple, but Silver Creek had other plans. Ruby's first days in Silver Creek had been a whirlwind of introductions and preparations. Mrs. Wilson had proven to be a kind, if somewhat overbearing landlady, insisting that Ruby needed fattening up after her journey and pressing additional helpings at every meal. The townspeople had been welcoming in their frontier way, direct and curious about the Boston lady teacher, but genuinely pleased she had come. The church, however, had been a disappointment. While the building itself was sound, a simple white structure with a small steeple, the interior was woefully inadequate for teaching. The benches were arranged for worship, not instruction, and there was no blackboard, no maps, and nowhere to store books or materials. Children need proper desks, Ruby had informed Mayor Hollister firmly after her initial inspection, and I'll need a blackboard at the very minimum. The mayor had tugged at his collar. Well, Miss Vance, we're working on getting the schoolhouse built as quickly as possible. For now, perhaps you could make do with. I understand the schoolhouse will take time, Ruby interrupted with the polite but unyielding tone she'd perfected as head girl at Miss Penrose's Academy for Young Ladies. But my students deserve better than making do in the meantime. I've drawn up a list of what's needed to convert the church temporarily. The mayor had looked startled, then impressed, then resigned as he took her carefully written list. I'll see what we can do, Miss Vance. Now, on her third day in Silver Creek, Ruby was at the church again, measuring the space and making notes in her small leather journal. She'd secured permission from Reverend Barnes to rearrange the benches and was considering how best to create a teaching area when she heard the wagon approaching. Stepping outside, she shielded her eyes against the afternoon sun and recognized the cowboy from her arrival day. He was driving a wagon loaded with lumber, his expression as closed as it had been before. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with features that might have been considered handsome if they ever relaxed from their guarded set. "Good afternoon," she called, walking toward the wagon. "Is that lumber for the church benches?" Grant nodded, surprised to find the Eastern woman alone at the church. "Mayor said to deliver it here. Reverend Barnes around to sign for it. He's visiting a sick parishioner." She approached the wagon, apparently untroubled by being alone with a stranger. "I'm Ruby Vance, the new teacher. I can sign for the delivery." Grant hesitated. "Grant Remington, I work for Carson Ranch." He wasn't sure why he'd offered his name, he rarely did, but something about her direct gaze made the usual nod seem insufficient. "Mr. Remington," she nodded with a slight smile. "I appreciate you bringing this. The children need proper seating for their lessons." Grant began unloading the lumber, aware of her watching him. Most women in town either flirted or avoided his eyes altogether, but Miss Vance simply observed with open curiosity. "Have you lived in Silver Creek long, Mr. Remington?" she asked as he carried the first boards toward the church steps. 3 years. "Do you enjoy ranching?" Grant paused. No one asked him such questions, having learned his preference for silence. "It suits me." "I imagine it's very different from teaching," she continued, undeterred by his brevity. "Though both require patience and dedication, I suppose." Grant said nothing, continuing to move the lumber. Why was she talking to him? Women like her, educated, refined, usually saved their conversation for shopkeepers or bankers or other women. Not ranch hands who clearly preferred silence. As he worked, Grant became uncomfortably aware of how dusty and sweat-stained his clothes were, how his hands were rough with calluses next to her smooth ones when she handed him the receipt book to sign. He scrawled his name quickly, anxious to complete the task and leave. "Mr. Remington," she said suddenly as he was preparing to depart, "may I ask you something?" He paused reluctantly. "Ma'am, is the church ever locked?" The question was so unexpected that Grant found himself actually looking directly into her eyes for the first time. They were indeed a clear, deep blue, observant and intelligent. "Why would you ask that?" he countered, genuinely puzzled. Ruby hadn't planned to ask the question. It had simply occurred to her as she watched the reserved cowboy work with efficient, controlled movements. Unlike most men she'd encountered in Silver Creek, who seemed eager to impress her with tales of frontier life, this one seemed determined to remain invisible despite his striking presence. "I'll be teaching here until the schoolhouse is completed," she explained. "I'll have books and materials to store. In Boston, doors have locks. I've noticed here many don't seem to." Something flickered across Grant's face, surprise perhaps or reassessment. "Church is never locked," he said finally. "No need, people respect it." "And if someone didn't," Ruby pressed. Grant studied her for a moment. "Then a lock wouldn't matter much. Out here it's not locks that keep people honest. It's knowing that dishonesty gets remembered." Ruby considered this, a community built on reputation rather than physical barriers. Something like that. Grant shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the philosophical turn of the conversation. Reverend leaves it open so folks can pray when needed. No one bothers what isn't theirs. Thank you for explaining, Ruby said, sensing his discomfort. And for delivering the lumber. Will you be building the benches as well? No, ma'am, town carpenter handles that. Ruby nodded, disappointed for reasons she couldn't quite identify. Well, thank you again, Mr. Remington. Grant tipped his hat and climbed back onto the wagon, relieved to escape the strange conversation and those too perceptive blue eyes. As he drove away, he found himself bothered by her question. Why would she ask about locks? Did she not feel safe? The thought was troubling. Silver Creek had its rough edges, but violence against women was one thing not tolerated. And why had he engaged with her at all? Grant usually limited his responses to the minimum required for civility. Instead, he'd found himself actually explaining frontier ethics to a woman he'd just met. Getting soft, he muttered to his horses as they trotted back toward the ranch road. He would need to be more careful. Engaging with the new teacher, or anyone, only created connections, and connections inevitably led to pain when they were severed. Better to remain as he was, self-sufficient and apart. But as the miles passed beneath the wagon wheels, Grant found himself remembering how Miss Vance had stood straight-backed beside the church, asking her curious question without hesitation or coquetry. There had been something refreshing about her directness, so different from the careful social dance most people performed around him. Doesn't matter, he told himself firmly. She's town business, not ranch business. Yet that evening, as he sat alone in his cabin with only a lantern and a day-old newspaper for company, Grant found himself wondering if Miss Ruby Vance had found his answer about the church satisfactory, and what other questions might be forming behind those thoughtful blue eyes. Ruby's first weeks in Silver Creek passed in a blur of activity. The church had been transformed as much as possible into a schoolroom, with newly built benches arranged in rows facing a modest blackboard that Mayor Hollister had somehow procured. Her 15 students ranged from 6 to 16 years old, with varying levels of previous education. To Ruby's surprise, she found teaching on the frontier more rewarding than her position at the Boston Academy had been. These children were eager to learn, unburdened by the rigid social expectations that had constrained her Eastern pupils. They asked direct questions, offered practical observations, and approached their studies with refreshing honesty. Miss Vance, 10-year-old Eliza Peterson, had asked during a geography lesson, "If Boston's so fine with its libraries and theaters, why'd you come to Silver Creek?" The blunt question had momentarily silenced the classroom. In Boston, such personal inquiry would have been considered the height of impropriety. Ruby had smiled. Because sometimes, Eliza, a person needs to start fresh. And sometimes the best place to build something new is where there's still open space to build it. The children had seemed to accept this answer, but Ruby knew that the adults of Silver Creek were likely wondering the same thing. A well-educated, unmarried woman of good family didn't typically choose to relocate to a frontier town without compelling reasons. Most assumed she had come for the adventure, or perhaps to find a husband among the territory's excessive bachelors. No one had guessed the truth, that she had fled financial ruin and social humiliation, that Silver Creek represented not adventure but refuge. As she settled into her new life, Ruby found herself watching for the tall cowboy who had delivered the lumber. Grant Remington came to town infrequently, it seemed, and when he did, he kept to himself. She would glimpse him sometimes at the general store or leading his horse down the main street, always alone, always moving with that same contained purpose. "That one keeps his own counsel," Mrs. Wilson had said when Ruby had casually inquired about him. "Been here 3 years and most folks know as little about him now as the day he rode in. Does his job at Carson's place better than most, they say, but never joins in socials or church gatherings." "Has he no family?" Ruby had asked, trying to sound merely conversationally interested. "None that anyone knows of. Some say he left trouble behind him somewhere east. Others think he might have lost someone, wife or sweetheart. Whatever his story, he doesn't share it." Mrs. Wilson had leaned forward confidentially. "Though I will say he's always been proper and polite when our paths cross. Some of these rough men forget their manners around a respectable woman, but not that one." Ruby had nodded thoughtfully. Their brief interaction at the church had left her curious. There had been intelligence in his eyes and a certain dignity in his reserve that seemed different from simple unfriendliness. And his question, "Why would you ask that?" had suggested a mind that probed beneath surface inquiries. One Saturday afternoon, about a month after her arrival, Ruby was returning from a walk along the creek that gave the town its name when a spring thunderstorm blew in with startling speed. The distant rumble of thunder had barely registered before the skies opened, drenching her immediately. Looking around for shelter, she realized the church was the nearest building and ran for it as lightning cracked overhead. Pushing through the door, she stumbled into the dim interior, dripping onto the wooden floor. To her surprise, she was not alone. Grant Remington stood near the altar, apparently similarly caught by the storm. He looked as startled to see her as she was to find him there. "Mr. Remington," she gasped, slightly breathless from her dash. "Miss Vance," he nodded, then seemed to notice her sodden state. After a moment's hesitation, he removed his coat, dry as he must have arrived before the downpour, and crossed the room to offer it to her. "You're soaked through." Ruby accepted the coat gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders. It was warm from his body and carried the scent of leather, horses, and pine. "Thank you. The storm caught me by surprise during my walk." Grant nodded, retreating to a respectful distance. "They move fast in the spring, be over soon enough." "Were you caught in it too?" she asked, gesturing to the church around them. A shadow passed over his face. "No, I was already here." The answer surprised her. From town gossip and his own manner, Ruby had assumed Grant Remington wasn't a church-going man. Yet here he was, alone in the church on a Saturday afternoon. The silence stretched between them, punctuated by the drumming of rain on the roof and occasional thunderclaps. Ruby was acutely aware of how improper their situation might appear to others, alone together in an empty building, yet the thought brought more curiosity than concern. What had brought this solitary man to the church today? "You asked if the church was ever locked," Grant said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Figured out why yet?" Ruby blinked at the unexpected reference to their previous conversation. "I suppose I was wondering about security for my teaching materials, but you were right, nothing has been disturbed." Grant studied her for a moment, then said quietly, "Church isn't just for Sundays. Some folks need it other times. Locking it would mean someone might not find shelter when they needed it most." The words seemed to hold more than their surface meaning, and Ruby sensed he wasn't speaking only of physical shelter. Before she could respond, he moved toward the window, checking the weather. "Rain's letting up, I should go. Carson's expecting me back." He hesitated, then added awkwardly, "You can keep the coat until you get back to your boarding house." "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to inconvenience you," Ruby said, reluctant to end this rare conversation with the enigmatic cowboy. "It's no trouble, I've got another at the ranch." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Vance." "Yes." Some questions don't have simple answers, but asking them, that matters sometimes. Before Ruby could decipher this cryptic statement, he was gone, stepping out into the misty aftermath of the storm and leaving her alone in the church, wrapped in his coat and thoroughly confused by the encounter. As she walked back to Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, still wearing Grant's coat, Ruby found herself intrigued by the brief glimpse beyond the cowboy's reserved exterior. He had been in the church alone, and his comment about the building providing shelter when needed most suggested personal experience. Was the rumor about him losing someone true? Did he come to the church seeking comfort for some old grief? By the time she reached her room, Ruby had admitted to herself that her interest in Grant Remington went beyond mere curiosity. There was something compelling about his quiet strength and hidden depths. In Boston, she would have dismissed him immediately as unsuitable, a working man with rough hands and few words. But Silver Creek was teaching her to look beyond surface judgments, to see value in different kinds of intelligence and character. As she hung his coat to dry, intending to return it the next time he came to town, Ruby wondered when that might be, and why she was looking forward to it with such unexpected anticipation. Grant rode back to the Carson ranch with his collar turned up against the lingering drizzle, cursing himself for his uncharacteristic talkativeness. What had possessed him to speak so openly to the schoolteacher? 3 years of careful distance from the townspeople, and he'd nearly revealed his private business to a woman he barely knew. Yet there had been something in her expression as she'd stood there dripping in the church doorway, something beyond the usual curiosity or judgment he encountered. She'd looked at him with genuine interest, as if she actually wanted to understand rather than simply categorize him as the town's resident loner. And those eyes, clear and direct but kind. They reminded him painfully of another pair of blue eyes, his sister Ellie's, before the fever had claimed her 5 years ago. Ellie, who had been his last living relative, whose death had sent him wandering westward with nothing but grief and guilt as companions. Grant had been visiting her grave in his thoughts when Miss Vance had burst into the church. He sometimes sat there in the quiet building, remembering Ellie's laugh and her unwavering belief that he would find happiness again someday. "You've got too much heart to be alone forever, Grant," she'd told him as she faded away. "Promise me you won't shut yourself away." He'd promised, but it had been a deathbed comfort, not a genuine commitment. After burying her, he drifted westward, taking work where he could find it, moving on whenever people started getting too friendly, asking too many questions. Carson's ranch had been the first place he'd stayed longer than a season, mainly because the old rancher respected boundaries and asked little beyond honest work. Now this schoolteacher with her direct questions and thoughtful eyes had disturbed his carefully constructed solitude. Worse, he'd given her his coat, a gesture that suggested connection, concern, things Grant had sworn to avoid. "Won't happen again," he muttered as he approached the ranch. He would retrieve the coat next time he was in town, keep the exchange brief and impersonal, and return to his isolated routine. Miss Ruby Vance was exactly the sort of complication he didn't need. An educated Eastern woman who would either leave when frontier life proved too harsh or marry some local businessman and become part of the town fabric. Either way, any attention he paid her was wasted energy. But as he unsaddled his horse in the barn, Grant found himself remembering how small she had looked in his oversized coat, and how for just a moment, talking to her had made the church feel less empty. The schoolhouse construction progressed slowly through May and into June. Ruby had settled into a comfortable routine, teaching during the week and exploring her new surroundings on weekends. Silver Creek was revealing itself as a community of surprising complexity, not the rough, lawless frontier town of Eastern imagination, but a place where people of diverse backgrounds were building something together, helping each other through the challenges of territorial life. She had made several friends, particularly among the mothers of her students, and had even been persuaded to join the Ladies' Aid Society that met weekly to sew and socialize. Ruby found their straightforward conversation refreshing after the veiled meanings and subtle slights of Boston society. Only one aspect of her new life remained unsatisfying. She had not spoken with Grant Remington since the day of the thunderstorm. She'd seen him in town occasionally, but always at a distance, and he seemed to deliberately avoid crossing her path. His coat hung in her closet, cleaned and pressed, waiting for an opportunity to return it that never came. Ruby told herself her disappointment was merely frustration at being unable to return borrowed property, but in honest moments she admitted the truth was more complicated. Their brief conversations had intrigued her, suggesting depths to the quiet cowboy that few in town seemed to recognize or value. Perhaps it was her teacher's instinct to draw out potential, or perhaps it was something more personal, a recognition of shared experience in his guarded eyes. Whatever the reason, Ruby found herself thinking of him at odd moments, when thunder rolled across the valley, when she passed the church during her walks, when Mrs. Wilson mentioned Carson Ranch at dinner. It was foolish, she knew. Grant Remington had made it clear he preferred solitude, and she had come to Silver Creek to build a new life, not to pine after an uninterested man. The 4th of July celebration provided a welcome distraction. Silver Creek transformed itself with bunting and flags, planning a day of festivities culminating in a dance at the newly constructed community hall. Even Ruby's most reserved students bubbled with excitement as the holiday approached. "Will you be at the dance, Miss Vance?" 12-year-old Sarah Hollister asked after class the day before the celebration. "I expect so," Ruby smiled, erasing the blackboard. "Your father would be disappointed if the teacher he brought all the way from Boston failed to appear at such an important town event. Jimmy Peterson says his ma says you'll have every unmarried man in the county asking you to dance," Sarah giggled. "On account of you being so pretty and refined." Ruby felt her cheeks warm. "That's very flattering, but I think Mrs. Peterson exaggerates." "Are you hoping anyone special will ask you?" Sarah persisted with a child's directness. Ruby hesitated, an image of Grant Remington flashing unbidden in her mind. "A dance is meant to be enjoyed with whoever asks politely," she said diplomatically. "Now run along home, tomorrow's a holiday for all of us." As Sarah skipped away, Ruby sighed. The prospect of the dance brought mixed feelings. While she enjoyed the company of many Silver Creek residents, the pointed matchmaking efforts of some were becoming uncomfortable. Mrs. Wilson and several mothers had made it clear they considered Ruby an excellent prospective wife for various bachelors in the area, and the dance would undoubtedly intensify their efforts. The morning of July 4th dawned clear and warm. Ruby dressed carefully in her best day dress, a sky blue cotton with white trim that she had altered to be slightly more fashionable while still appropriate for a teacher. The town square was already filling with people as she walked down from the boarding house, the smell of barbecue and the sound of a fiddle filling the air. She spent the morning enjoying the festivities, watching children's races, applauding patriotic recitations, and sampling the potluck dishes that filled long tables beneath shady trees. Several men did indeed seek her company, from the shy young bank clerk to the widowed blacksmith, and Ruby chatted pleasantly with each, careful not to encourage or discourage anyone unduly. It was mid-afternoon when she spotted Grant Remington on the outskirts of the celebration. He stood apart from the crowd, watching the festivities with the same reserved expression she remembered. Unlike most men present, he wore no special clothes for the holiday, just his usual work attire, though it appeared cleaner than his everyday wear. Making a swift decision, Ruby excused herself from Mrs. Peterson's company and walked toward him, her heart beating a little faster than the warm day warranted. She carried his coat, carefully wrapped in brown paper and string, which she had brought specifically in case he appeared today. "Mr. Remington," she greeted him as she approached. "I'm glad to see you at the celebration." Grant looked momentarily startled to be addressed directly, especially by her. He touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Vance." "I've been hoping to return this to you," she said, offering the wrapped package. "Thank you for lending it to me during the storm. It was very kind." He accepted the package awkwardly. Wasn't necessary to wrap it. "Perhaps not, but it seemed proper," Ruby smiled. "Are you enjoying the festivities?" Grant glanced at the celebrating townspeople. "Just came in for supplies, happened to be today." "Well, since you're here, you should at least try some of the food," Ruby suggested. Mrs. Wilson's apple pie won the baking contest. It truly is exceptional. Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. Not much for crowds. "Neither am I, truthfully," Ruby admitted. In Boston, social gatherings were often more about observation and judgment than enjoyment. Here it's different, but still. She gestured to where several people were watching their conversation with undisguised interest. Small towns have their own kind of scrutiny. Grant followed her gaze and frowned slightly, "Giving them something to talk about standing here with me." "People will always talk," Ruby said with a shrug. "In Boston, they gossiped because my father lost his money. Here, they gossip because I'm new and female. At least here the gossip seems generally good-natured." Grant's expression changed subtly. "Your father lost his money." Ruby hadn't meant to reveal that piece of her past. "Yes, investments that failed. He died shortly after. It's why I came west to start fresh." Grant was silent for a moment, studying her with new interest. "Takes courage coming all this way alone." "Or desperation," Ruby said lightly, though the admission cost her. "Sometimes circumstances don't leave much choice." Another silence fell between them, but it felt different from their previous encounters, less guarded, more contemplative. Around them, the celebration continued, but they stood in a pocket of quiet understanding. "Will you stay for the dance?" Ruby asked finally. Grant shook his head. "Need to get back to the ranch." "Of course," Ruby tried to hide her disappointment. "Well, I'm glad I was able to return your coat. And thank you again for lending it." Grant nodded, seeming to struggle with something. Finally he said, "Miss Vance." "Ruby, there you are." Mayor Hollister's booming voice interrupted whatever Grant had been about to say. The portly man approached with a broad smile. "The children are about to give their patriotic recitation. As their teacher, you should be front and center." Ruby hesitated, looking back at Grant, but his expression had already closed again, the brief moment of openness gone. "Of course, Mayor, I'll be right there." She turned back to Grant. "You were saying, Mr. Remington." "Nothing important," he said, tucking the wrapped coat under his arm. "Enjoy your celebration, Miss Vance." Before she could respond, he touched his hat again and walked away, threading through the crowd toward where his horse was tethered. Ruby watched him go, feeling as though a door had begun to open only to be firmly closed again. "Not very sociable, that one," Mayor Hollister remarked, following her gaze. "Carson says he's the best ranch hand he's ever had, but town matters don't interest him much." "Perhaps he simply values his privacy," Ruby suggested, allowing the mayor to lead her toward the children's performance. Perhaps, the mayor agreed dubiously. Speaking of sociability, I hear young Dr. Mitchell has been asking after you. Fine man, educated back east like yourself. Would make an excellent match for our school teacher. Ruby smiled politely, allowing the conversation to move to safer topics as they rejoined the celebration. But her thoughts kept returning to Grant Remington and what he might have been about to say before they were interrupted. The dance that evening was everything the townspeople had promised, the new community hall decorated with flags and lanterns, a three-piece band playing lively tunes, and refreshments flowing freely. Ruby danced with several partners, including the attentive Dr. Mitchell, but found her enjoyment dimmed by a lingering sense of missed opportunity. As predicted, Grant Remington did not appear at the dance. And as Ruby walked home under the stars later that night, listening to the distant sounds of continuing celebration, she wondered why his absence affected her so much more than the presence of all her other acquaintances combined. Grant rode back to Carson Ranch with the wrapped coat balanced across his saddle horn, unsettled by his encounter with Ruby Vance. He'd been avoiding her deliberately since the day in the church, telling himself it was the sensible course. Involvement of any kind, even simple friendship, inevitably led to complications, expectations, and eventually disappointment. He'd learned that lesson too many times to ignore it. Yet their brief conversation at the celebration had left him feeling both relieved and regretful. Relieved to have retrieved his coat and ended the small connection between them, but regretful at the glimpse of genuine interest in her eyes. No one had looked at Grant that way in a very long time, as if what he thought actually mattered, as if his words were worth hearing. And her casual revelation about her father's financial ruin and death had struck an unexpected chord. Grant understood what it meant to lose everything and start again in a place where no one knew your history or your pain. He'd done exactly that after Ellie died, carrying his grief westward until he found a place remote enough that he could breathe again without memories choking him. Different circumstances, he muttered to his horse as they cantered along the ranch road. Miss Vance had come west for a fresh start, yes, but she was building connections, integrating herself into Silver Creek's community. Her approach was the healthy one, moving forward, creating a new life. Grant, in contrast, had chosen isolation as a shield against further loss. 3 years at Carson Ranch and he still lived in the small cabin farthest from the main house, still avoided Sunday gatherings, still kept conversation to a minimum. Old Carson had stopped inviting him to holiday meals after the first year, recognizing that Grant preferred the solitude of his cabin to forced socializing. But today, for just a moment, when Ruby Vance had stood before him describing her journey west with simple honesty, Grant had almost broken his own rule. He'd almost suggested that perhaps they understood each other better than others might think, almost acknowledged the subtle connection he'd felt since their first meeting. The mayor's interruption had been both frustration and relief. Grant had no business forming attachments, especially to a woman like Ruby Vance. She deserved someone like that doctor the mayor had mentioned, educated, established, comfortable in society. Someone whose past and future were equally respectable. As the ranch buildings came into view, Grant made a firm decision. He would avoid town as much as possible in the coming weeks, and if he did encounter Miss Vance again, he would keep their interaction brief and impersonal. The coat was returned, the minor connection severed. Life would continue as before. But that night, as he unwrapped the package she had so carefully prepared, Grant found himself holding the coat to his face for a moment, detecting the faint scent of lavender that clung to the fabric. It was a foolish, sentimental gesture, one he immediately regretted. Yet as he hung the coat on its peg, he couldn't help remembering how Ruby Vance's eyes had brightened when she'd seen him at the celebration, as if his presence had genuinely pleased her. Doesn't matter, he told himself firmly, turning away. She'll be like all the rest, married or gone within a year. Yet even as he thought it, Grant wondered if Ruby Vance might prove more resilient than he expected. After all, she'd already survived loss and upheaval to build a new life on the frontier. There was steel beneath those refined manners. He'd seen it in her direct gaze and felt it in her firm handshake when she'd given him back his coat. For the first time in years, Grant found himself thinking about a future that might include something beyond solitary work and silent evenings. The thought was both enticing and terrifying, and he pushed it away firmly as he prepared for bed. Such thinking led nowhere good. He had made his choice long ago, safety through solitude. One conversation with a pretty schoolteacher wasn't going to change that, but as summer deepened toward autumn, Grant found his resolve tested in unexpected ways. August brought relentless heat to Silver Creek, making the church uncomfortably warm for lessons. Ruby often moved her class outdoors in the afternoons, teaching under the shade of large cottonwoods near the creek. The children thrived in this natural classroom, and Ruby found herself adapting her Boston methods to incorporate more of the practical knowledge her frontier students already possessed. Miss Vance, 10-year-old Thomas Baker, asked during a natural science lesson, "Why are we learning about ocean creatures when we've got plenty of animals right here that matter more?" Instead of reprimanding him for questioning the curriculum as she might have done in Boston, Ruby considered the question seriously. "You make an excellent point, Thomas. While it's important to know about the wider world, practical knowledge of local wildlife is certainly more immediately useful." The next day, she brought in Jade Mason, a local hunter, to speak to the children about the animals of the region. The lesson was so successful that Ruby began incorporating more local experts into her teaching, a development that led, indirectly, to her next encounter with Grant Remington. "Carson Ranch has the finest horses in the territory," Mayor Hollister told her during a school board meeting in late August. "For your unit on regional industry, you might consider taking the children for a tour. Old Carson's proud of his operation, and young Remington has a way with the animals that's something to see." Ruby tried to hide her immediate interest. "Do you think Mr. Carson would agree to such a visit?" "Already mentioned it to him in passing. He seemed amenable, said to have you write formally requesting a date." That evening, Ruby composed a careful letter to Mr. Carson explaining the educational purpose of the proposed visit and expressing her hope that it would be convenient. She made no specific mention of Grant Remington, though the thought of seeing him again colored her anticipation of the excursion. Carson's reply came quickly, a brief note accepting her proposal and suggesting the following Friday afternoon. "My foreman, Grant Remington, will conduct the tour," the rancher had written in a spidery hand. "He knows the operation better than anyone." Ruby read the note several times, her pulse quickening at this unexpected development. Grant was Carson's foreman. She had assumed he was simply a ranch hand. And he would be conducting the tour personally. After their last meeting, she had expected him to arrange his duties to avoid such an encounter. When Friday arrived, Ruby gathered her 15 students and led them on the 5-mile walk to Carson Ranch, reminding them repeatedly about appropriate behavior when visiting a working ranch. The older boys were particularly excited about seeing the horses, while some of the girls whispered and giggled about meeting the mysterious Mr. Remington, whose reserved manner had apparently become the subject of romantic speculation among the town's young women. The ranch spread across a verdant valley with a main house, several barns, corrals, and bunkhouses arranged in a functional pattern. As they approached, Ruby saw a tall figure waiting by the main corral, Grant Remington, looking much as he had at their previous meetings, though perhaps slightly less dusty. His expression was unreadable as the group approached. "Good afternoon, Mr. Remington," Ruby called, trying to sound professionally neutral despite her racing heart. "Thank you for agreeing to show us the ranch operations." Grant nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly before moving to the children. "Welcome to Carson Ranch. Mr. Carson apologizes he couldn't greet you himself. He's in town on business today." The children lined up as Ruby had instructed, though several of the boys were already straining toward the corral where several magnificent horses grazed. Grant seemed to notice their interest. "We'll start with the horses, since that's what Carson Ranch is known for," he said, his voice taking on a more comfortable tone as he addressed the practical matter at hand. "Then we'll see the cattle operation and how a working ranch functions." To Ruby's surprise, Grant proved to be an excellent guide. Though still reserved, he spoke knowledgeably about the ranch operations, explaining the breeding program, training methods, and daily routines in terms the children could understand. When demonstrating how to approach a young horse, his movements became fluid and confident, his usual tension melting away as he connected with the animal. The children responded well to his straightforward manner, especially when he allowed the older ones to help groom a gentle mare. Even the most rambunctious boys listened attentively when Grant explained the importance of proper care and respect for the animals. Ruby watched him with growing fascination. This was a different Grant Remington than the guarded man she'd encountered in town, still quiet but purposeful and engaged, occasionally even smiling slightly at the children's enthusiastic questions. He was in his element here, surrounded by the animals and work he understood. As the tour progressed to the cattle pens, Ruby found herself walking beside Grant while the children clustered around a ranch hand demonstrating how to use a lariat. "You're very good with them," she observed quietly. "The children, I mean, they're listening to you better than they sometimes listen to me." Grant glanced at her, seeming uncomfortable with the compliment. "Just talking about what I know." "That's precisely what makes it effective," Ruby smiled. "They recognize authentic knowledge. I didn't realize you were the ranch foreman." Something like embarrassment crossed his face. "Carson promoted me last spring, didn't seem worth mentioning." "It's quite an achievement," Ruby persisted. "Mr. Carson is known to be particular about who he trusts with responsibility." Grant was silent for a moment, then said, "Had some experience before coming here." "With horses, mainly." This small volunteered piece of information felt significant, and Ruby seized the opening. "Where was that, if you don't mind my asking?" Grant hesitated, then said reluctantly, "Missouri originally, then Kansas. Worked a few ranches before landing here." "You've traveled quite extensively," Ruby said, trying to picture the journey. "I've only ever lived in Boston before coming to Silver Creek." "Boston to Montana's a considerable journey itself," Grant observed, "especially alone." "Yes, well, sometimes change is necessary, even when difficult." Ruby watched the children laughing as they attempted to twirl the lariat. "I've found Silver Creek to be worth the journey, though. The people here are genuine in a way I find refreshing." Grant studied her for a moment. "Not all who come west feel that way. Many find it too rough, too isolated." "Perhaps," Ruby acknowledged, "but there's a certain freedom in the straightforwardness here. In Boston, there were so many unspoken rules, so many judgments based on circumstances beyond one's control." She smiled ruefully. "When my father's investments failed, former friends crossed the street rather than speak to me. No one would say directly that we were no longer acceptable, but their actions made it abundantly clear." Grant frowned. "Seems a poor way to treat people." "It was," Ruby agreed simply, "which is why I value directness now, even when it's uncomfortable. At least here, if someone dislikes you, you generally know why." Their eyes met, and Ruby felt a moment of connection, an understanding that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. Then a shout from one of the children broke the moment, and Grant moved away to prevent a boy from climbing the corral fence. The tour concluded with refreshments provided by the ranch cook, lemonade and cookies served at outdoor tables near the main house. As the children enjoyed their treats, Ruby found herself standing apart with Grant once more. "Thank you for today," she said sincerely. "It's been educational for all of us." Grant nodded. "They're good kids. Ask smart questions." "High praise from someone who doesn't waste words," Ruby smiled. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "Mr. Remington, Grant, I've enjoyed our conversations, brief as they've been. I feel we might understand each other in ways that—" She hesitated, then pressed on. "Would you consider calling on me sometime, perhaps for a Sunday walk after church?" The invitation hung between them, bold and unmistakable. Ruby felt her cheeks warm but held his gaze steadily. She had never been so forward with a man before, but frontier life had taught her that opportunities must sometimes be seized directly. Grant's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, consideration, and then something like regret. "Miss Vance." "Ruby," she corrected gently. "Ruby," he acknowledged, the sound of her name in his deep voice sending an unexpected thrill through her. "I'm not the kind of man who calls on ladies. My life is here on the ranch. It's simpler that way." "Simpler," Ruby repeated, "but is simpler always better?" Grant looked away, watching the children. "For some of us, yes. I've chosen this life deliberately. It suits me." "I see." Ruby tried to keep the disappointment from her voice. "Well, the invitation remains open, should you ever decide that simplicity might occasionally accommodate companionship." He met her eyes again, and for a moment, Ruby thought she saw longing beneath his reserve. But he merely nodded, then said, "We should get the children back on the road if they're to reach town before sunset." The walk back to Silver Creek was filled with excited chatter as the children discussed their favorite parts of the tour, but Ruby found herself unusually quiet, reflecting on the day's interactions. Grant had rejected her invitation, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that his reluctance stemmed not from disinterest, but from something deeper, some barrier he had erected between himself and others that had nothing to do with her personally. As the church steeple came into view, marking their return to town, Ruby made a decision. She would not pursue Grant Remington further, she had too much pride and self-respect for that, but neither would she accept his rejection as final. Something in their connection felt unfinished, a conversation only partially had. And if teaching had taught her anything, it was patience with those who needed time to find their own answers. The autumn cattle drive kept Grant busier than usual through September and into early October. Carson had expanded the herd significantly that year, and preparing the animals for the long drive to the railhead demanded all of Grant's attention and energy. He worked from dawn until well after dusk, falling into his bed each night too exhausted to think about anything beyond the next day's tasks. Which was exactly how he preferred it. Physical exhaustion left no room for dwelling on Ruby Vance's invitation or the look in her eyes when he declined it. No space to question whether his instinct to maintain distance was protecting him from pain or simply ensuring its continuation in a different form. When he did allow himself to consider their conversation, Grant told himself he had made the only sensible choice. A man with his history had no business calling on a respectable woman like Ruby Vance. Even if she had initiated the invitation, even if something in her direct gaze suggested she might understand his reticence better than most. "You're becoming a hermit before your time," Carson told him bluntly one evening as they reviewed the drive preparations. The old rancher rarely commented on personal matters, which made his observation all the more startling. "Just focused on the work," Grant replied, keeping his eyes on the ledger. Carson snorted. "Work's important, but it's not everything. Man your age should have more to think about than cattle and horses." Grant said nothing, hoping the subject would be dropped. Carson studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Heard from Mayor Hollister that the schoolteacher was asking about you after that class visit. Seemed impressed by how you handled the children and explained the operation." Grant kept his expression neutral. "Miss Vance was just being polite." "Maybe," Carson conceded, "or maybe she sees something in you worth knowing better. Smart woman by all accounts, might be worth considering." "I'm not looking for complications," Grant said more sharply than he'd intended. Carson leaned back in his chair, regarding Grant with shrewd eyes. "Son, I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion for 3 years, avoiding town gatherings and keeping everyone at arm's length. Whatever you're running from, it follows you closer than your shadow." Grant stiffened. "I'm not running from anything." "We all run from something," Carson said quietly. "Question is whether the running does any good in the end." He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "Drive leaves day after tomorrow. Get some rest tonight, you'll need it." As October progressed, the cattle safely delivered to the railhead and the ranch settling into its winter routine, Grant found Carson's words returning to him at odd moments. Was he still running? He'd thought of his solitude as a choice, a protection against the kind of devastation he'd felt when Ellie died. But increasingly, it felt less like safety and more like a prison of his own making. The first snow fell in early November, a gentle dusting that melted by midday but served as a reminder of the harsher weather to come. Grant was in town purchasing winter supplies when he spotted Ruby Vance emerging from the general store, her arms full of packages. She wore a deep blue coat with a matching bonnet, her breath visible in the crisp air. For a moment he considered pretending not to see her, completing his errands and returning to the ranch without interaction. But something, perhaps Carson's words, perhaps his own growing weariness with isolation, made him hesitate. Before he could decide, Ruby looked up and saw him. She paused briefly, then walked toward him with a smile that showed no trace of resentment for his previous rejection. "Mr. Remington," she greeted him, "how nice to see you. I heard the cattle drive was successful." Grant nodded, touching the brim of his hat. "Miss Vance, yes, got a good price this year." "That's wonderful news, Mr. Carson must be pleased." She adjusted her packages, which seemed on the verge of slipping. "Let me help you with those," Grant offered, taking several parcels before they could fall. "Thank you," Ruby smiled. "Mrs. Wilson asked me to pick up a few things for Thanksgiving preparations. She's determined to outdo herself this year." "You're spending Thanksgiving at the boarding house?" Grant asked, falling into step beside her as they walked down the street. "Yes, Mrs. Wilson insists all her boarders participate. It's quite the production, apparently." Ruby glanced at him. "Will you be joining the Carson Ranch celebration?" Grant hesitated. "Haven't decided yet." Ruby studied him for a moment, then said with gentle directness, "You know, Mr. Remington, holidays can be difficult when they remind us of absent loved ones. I still find myself thinking of my father at such times, wishing he could see the life I've built here." The observation was so close to his thoughts about Ellie that Grant nearly missed a step. Carson mentioned the schoolteacher was perceptive, he said after a moment. He wasn't exaggerating. Ruby smiled, pleased by the backhanded compliment. Teaching requires understanding what isn't explicitly stated. Children aren't always able to articulate their true concerns. They walked in companionable silence for a few moments. Grant was surprised by how comfortable it felt to simply walk beside her through town, carrying her packages like any gentleman might for a lady of his acquaintance. It was such a normal, everyday interaction, the kind he'd been avoiding for years. As they approached the boarding house, Ruby turned to him. "Mr. Remington, Grant, I know you declined my previous invitation and I respect your decision, but I want you to know that my door is always open should you ever wish for conversation or companionship." Grant looked down at her, struck again by the clarity and kindness in her blue eyes. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because I believe everyone deserves connection," Ruby answered without hesitation, "even those who think they're better off without it." Before Grant could respond, the boarding house door opened and Mrs. Wilson appeared, calling for Ruby to hurry inside before her packages froze. Grant handed over the parcels he'd been carrying, suddenly aware of how their extended conversation might appear to the town's most notorious gossip. "Thank you for your assistance," Ruby said formally, clearly also aware of Mrs. Wilson's watching eyes. But as she took the packages, her fingers brushed his deliberately. "Consider what I said, please." Grant nodded, touching his hat in farewell before turning back toward the general store to complete his errands. As he walked, he found himself considering not just Ruby's words but the gentle challenge in them. She had seen through his carefully constructed solitude to the loss beneath it, yet instead of pitying him, she had offered simple understanding and the possibility of connection without pressure or expectation. For the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, Grant felt the wall he had built around himself beginning to crack. The Thursday before Thanksgiving brought an unexpected early blizzard to Silver Creek. Ruby had dismissed her students at the first sign of heavy snow, ensuring the town children reached their homes, and the ranch children were collected by parents or older siblings before the worst of the storm hit. By late afternoon, snow was falling so thickly that Ruby could barely see across the street from her window at the boarding house. Mrs. Wilson bustled about, stoking fires and muttering about the impact on her Thanksgiving preparations if the storm continued. "Delivery of my special-ordered cranberries might be delayed," she fretted as she served an early supper to her boarders. "And the Petersons were supposed to bring an extra turkey tomorrow morning." "I'm sure it will clear by then," Ruby reassured her, though the howling wind suggested otherwise. "Montana storms move through quickly, don't they?" Before Mrs. Wilson could respond, a pounding at the front door interrupted their conversation. She hurried to answer it, returning moments later with Mayor Hollister, his hat and coat covered in snow. "Miss Vance," he said without preamble, "we have a situation. The Carson ranch wagon was caught in the storm while returning some of the children. They've made it to the church but can't continue in this weather. Reverend Barnes is out of town visiting his sister, so the church is empty." Ruby stood immediately. "Are the children all right?" "Seems so, but they're cold and frightened. Two of the Carson hands are with them, but neither knows how to light the church stove properly, and they're concerned about the children spending the night there without proper supplies." "I'll come at once," Ruby said, already reaching for her coat. "Mrs. Wilson, could you prepare some food and hot drinks? I'll need blankets as well." The older woman nodded. "I'll have everything ready in 10 minutes. Foolish to be out in such weather, but those poor children." Within the hour, Ruby was trudging through knee-deep snow toward the church, accompanied by the mayor and his son carrying supplies. The wind cut through her coat despite its thickness, and she could barely see the lantern Mayor Hollister held aloft to guide their way. The church loomed suddenly out of the whiteness, its windows glowing faintly with what must be lamplight inside. The mayor pushed through the heavy door, allowing Ruby to enter first, stomping snow from her boots. The sight that greeted her made her heart contract. 5 children, all from outlying ranches, including Carson's, huddled in the front pews, wrapped in what appeared to be horse blankets. A small fire burned in the pot-bellied stove, but it was clearly inadequate for the space. And standing beside the children, his expression a mixture of concern and relief at their arrival, was Grant Remington. "Miss Vance," he acknowledged, his voice rough from the cold. "Mayor." "Mr. Remington," Ruby responded, immediately moving toward the children. "Is everyone all right?" Grant nodded, cold and hungry but no frostbite. Peterson went for help while I brought the children here, nearest place we could reach in the storm. Ruby knelt beside the children, recognizing 10-year-old Eliza Peterson, 12-year-old James Williams, and 3 others from her class. "You're safe now," she reassured them. "We've brought food and blankets and we'll stay right here until the storm passes." As she and the mayor distributed soup from insulated containers and wrapped the children in proper blankets, Ruby noticed that Grant himself looked half frozen, his coat dusted with snow and his face reddened from the wind. He had clearly given his own comfort secondary consideration to the children's. "Mr. Remington, you should warm yourself as well," she said, approaching him with a steaming cup of coffee after the children were settled. He accepted it with a nod of thanks. Was more worried about getting them somewhere safe. Storm came on faster than expected. "You did exactly right bringing them here," Ruby said, lowering her voice, "but you need to take care of yourself too. You're no good to them if you become ill." Grant's lips quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Sounds like something my sister used to say." The casual mention of a sister, a piece of personal history freely offered, surprised Ruby. "Your sister sounds wise." "She was," Grant said quietly, and the past tense told Ruby everything she needed to know about why he had used that particular comparison. Before she could respond, Mayor Hollister approached. "I need to return to town to report that the children are safe and arrange for morning relief if the storm hasn't abated. Will you be all right here with Mr. Remington, Miss Vance?" Ruby nodded, perfectly all right. The children need stability and rest now more than anything. After the mayor departed, promising to return at first light if possible, Ruby organized the church interior for an overnight stay. The children were settled in the front pews with multiple blankets, while she and Grant took positions near the stove to maintain the fire throughout the night. As the children drifted to sleep, exhausted by their ordeal, Ruby found herself sitting beside Grant on a bench near the stove, close enough to speak quietly without disturbing the young sleepers. "It was fortunate you knew the church was never locked," she said softly, recalling their conversation months earlier. Grant glanced at her, the firelight casting shadows across his features. "Thought of that when the storm hit. Knew it would be safe and accessible. A sanctuary when needed most," Ruby quoted his words from their previous conversation in this same building. Grant nodded, studying the flames through the stove's small window. "My sister died 5 years ago," he said suddenly, his voice so low Ruby had to lean closer to hear it. "Fever took her in less than a week. She was the last family I had." The admission, offered without prompting, felt like a gift of immense value. Ruby remained silent, sensing he needed to continue without interruption. "After the funeral, I couldn't stay in that town. Too many memories, so I started drifting west, working ranches, never staying more than a season or two." He glanced at the sleeping children. "Ellie loved children. She was a teacher like you." "I'm sorry for your loss," Ruby said simply when he fell silent. "She must have been very special." "She was," Grant agreed. "Always saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Especially me." He stared into the fire again. "I promised her I wouldn't shut myself away after she was gone, broke that promise pretty thoroughly." Ruby considered her response carefully. "Perhaps," she said finally, "but you're here now talking to me, that's something." Grant looked at her directly then, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "You remind me of her sometimes." Not in looks, Ellie had dark hair and was small as a bird, but in how you see people, how you don't give up on them. "Some people are worth not giving up on," Ruby said softly. "Even when they try to convince you otherwise." Their eyes held in the firelight, and Ruby felt something shift between them, a barrier dissolving, a connection deepening. Then one of the children whimpered in sleep, breaking the moment. Grant rose immediately, checking on each child before returning to the fire and adding another log. Ruby watched him, noting the gentleness with which he tucked blankets more securely around small shoulders, the quiet reassurance he offered when one boy briefly woke disoriented. When he returned to the bench, he sat slightly closer than before. "Should try to get some rest," he suggested. "I'll watch the fire." "We'll take turns," Ruby countered. "There's no reason for you to stay awake all night." Grant looked as if he might argue, then nodded. 2-hour shifts then." Ruby smiled at the compromise. "Agreed," she hesitated, then added, "Thank you for telling me about Ellie. I know it wasn't easy." Grant was quiet for a long moment. "Easier than I expected," he admitted finally.
With you.
The simple acknowledgement warmed Ruby more thoroughly than the stove's heat. As she settled into a pew for her rest period, watching Grant's profile against the firelight, she felt a certainty growing within her that tonight had changed something fundamental between them. The blizzard continued through the night, but inside the church the small group remained safe and warm. When Ruby took her turn watching the fire, she found herself gazing at Grant's sleeping form, noting how his features softened in repose, making him appear closer to his actual age. In sleep, the guardedness fell away, revealing the young man beneath the carefully constructed exterior. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving Silver Creek buried under nearly 3 feet of snow. The church door opened shortly after dawn to reveal Carson himself with a rescue party on horseback, prepared to transport the children back to their homes. Remington, the old rancher, acknowledged with evident relief.
Mayor said you'd gotten the children to safety. Good work.
Grant nodded. Miss Vance and the mayor brought supplies, made for a comfortable night, all things considered.
Carson turned to Ruby with a respectful nod.
Town's fortunate to have you, Miss Vance. Not every schoolteacher would brave a blizzard for their students.
I could do no less, Ruby replied simply. Mr. Remington is the true hero here. He brought the children to shelter through the worst of the storm.
As the rescue party prepared to depart, Grant approached Ruby, standing slightly apart from the others. "I'll be in town next Sunday," he said quietly, "for church service. Thought perhaps afterward if the offer still stands."
"It does," Ruby confirmed, her heart lightening. "I would enjoy a walk very much, weather permitting."
Grant's lips curved in a genuine smile, the first she had seen from him, "Even if it snows again."
Ruby laughed softly. "After last night, I think we've proven we can manage in adverse conditions."
His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Sunday, then." As she watched him mount his horse and ride away with the rescue party, Ruby felt a buoyant hope rising within her. The night in the church had broken through barriers that months of careful interactions had only dented. Grant Remington was still a man of few words, still carrying the weight of his past, but he had taken the first step toward connection, toward fulfilling the promise he had made to his sister. And Ruby found herself increasingly certain that she wanted to be part of wherever those steps might lead. The Sunday following the blizzard dawned clear and cold, with sunlight sparkling off pristine snow that still blanketed Silver Creek despite efforts to clear the main streets. Ruby dressed carefully for church, selecting a dark green wool dress that complemented her coloring while remaining appropriate for both worship and the walk that would follow. Mrs. Wilson noticed her particular attention to her appearance and smiled knowingly. "Heard Mr. Remington brought those children to safety during the storm. Quite the hero, they're saying in town."
"He acted with great courage and presence of mind," Ruby agreed neutrally, adjusting her hat in the mirror.
"Never thought I'd see him in church," the older woman continued. "Not in the 3 years he's been at Carson's place, yet Mayor Hollister tells me he's planning to attend service today."
Ruby met Mrs. Wilson's eyes in the mirror. "People change, Mrs. Wilson. Sometimes they just need a reason to." The older woman's expression softened. "Indeed they do, my dear, indeed they do."
The church was unusually crowded that Sunday, as many townspeople came to hear Reverend Barnes offer thanks for the children's safety during the blizzard. Ruby slipped into her usual pew near the middle of the sanctuary, trying not to obviously watch the door for Grant's arrival. When he finally appeared just as the service was about to begin, a ripple of whispers spread through the congregation. Grant Remington at Sunday service was apparently noteworthy enough to distract from worship momentarily. He wore clean, pressed clothes, not formal Sunday best like some of the townspeople, but respectably neat, and his hair was combed neatly beneath his hat, which he removed upon entering. He caught Ruby's eye briefly as he took a seat in the last pew, and the subtle nod he gave her confirmed that their planned walk was still his intention. Throughout the service, Ruby found her attention divided between Reverend Barnes' sermon and the tall figure sitting quietly at the back of the church. When the service concluded, Ruby remained in her pew, allowing the usual post-worship socializing to flow around her while covertly watching Grant navigate uncomfortable conversations with curious townspeople. Several men clapped him on the shoulder, apparently congratulating him for his actions during the storm, while a few of the women who had children in the stranded group approached with evident gratitude. Finally, the crowd thinned enough for Grant to make his way to Ruby's pew. "Miss Vance," he greeted her, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty that touched her. This was unfamiliar territory for him, a social call publicly acknowledged. "Mr. Remington," she responded with a warm smile, "I'm glad you could attend service today." "Said I would," he replied simply. Then, with visible effort, he added, "Weather's clear enough for that walk if you're still interested." "Very much so," Ruby assured him, gathering her coat and gloves. "Shall we?" They made their way outside, navigating the curious glances and not-so-subtle smiles of the remaining parishioners. Once on the street, Grant offered his arm with a formality that suggested he was recalling manners long disused. Ruby placed her hand lightly on his sleeve, feeling the solid warmth of him even through the layers of their winter clothing. "Where would you like to walk?" she asked as they moved away from the church. Grant hesitated. "Creek might be pretty with the snow if that's not too far." "Not at all, I'd enjoy seeing it." They walked in companionable silence for several minutes, their boots crunching on the packed snow of the main street before turning onto the narrower path that led towards Silver Creek. Ruby was content to allow Grant the space to find his conversational footing, sensing that pushing too quickly might cause him to retreat behind his customary reserve. "Church was full today," he observed finally. Ruby nodded. "The children's safe return is cause for celebration. You're something of a hero in town now, whether you wish to be or not." Grant looked uncomfortable, just did what anyone would. "Perhaps," Ruby acknowledged, "but you were the one who actually did it. People appreciate that kind of decisive action, especially when children are involved." They reached the creek, which ran partially frozen between snow-covered banks. The winter sun sparkled off ice crystals, creating a scene of pristine beauty that momentarily silenced them both. "It's lovely," Ruby breathed, taking in the untouched winter landscape. Grant nodded, looking not at the scenery but at her. "Carson says I'm becoming a hermit before my time." The abrupt change of subject surprised Ruby, but she recognized its significance. "And what do you think?" "Think he might be right." Grant's jaw worked as if he were chewing over difficult words. "After Ellie died, being alone seemed safer. Couldn't lose what you didn't have." Ruby considered this. "That's understandable. Loss changes how we see the world and our place in it." "But it's no kind of life," Grant continued, his voice gaining conviction. "Realized that during the storm, watching you with those children, seeing how people came together to help, made me think about what Ellie would say if she could see how I've been living." "And what would she say?" Ruby asked gently. A ghost of a smile touched Grant's lips. "She'd call me a stubborn fool, tell me life's for living, not just surviving." "Your sister sounds very wise," Ruby said, echoing her words from the night in the church. "She was." Grant turned to face Ruby fully, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "The night in the church, talking with you, first time in 5 years I've spoken about her without feeling like I was being crushed under the weight of it." Ruby's heart ached for the lonely path he had walked. Sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter, even when logic suggests it should be the opposite. "Never been much for sharing burdens," Grant admitted, "but I'm beginning to think that might need to change." They had stopped walking, standing face to face beside the frozen creek. Ruby could see the internal struggle playing out in Grant's expression, the habitual reserve warring with a newfound desire for connection. "Ruby," he said, her name still sounding new on his lips, "I'm not good at this, at talking at. Being with people 3 years in Silver Creek and you know more about me than anyone else here, that should tell you something." "It tells me you're careful about who you trust," Ruby said. "There's nothing wrong with that." Grant shook his head. "It's more than careful, it's been hiding from life, from possibilities." He took a deep breath. "I can't promise I'll suddenly become sociable or comfortable with town gatherings, but I'd like to try. With you, to see if there might be a middle ground between total isolation and that." The halting declaration was more meaningful to Ruby than the most eloquent proposal might have been from another man. She understood what it cost him to voice these thoughts, to deliberately step away from the safety of his solitude. "I would like that very much," she said simply. Grant's expression lightened, relief evident in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. "Don't really know how this works, calling on someone, I mean." Ruby smiled. "I think we're figuring it out as we go. Sunday walks might be a good place to start." "Sunday walks," he repeated, as if committing the concept to memory. Then, with a hesitation that made Ruby's heart constrict, he added, "Would you mind if I wrote to you too, between Sundays? Always been better with written words than spoken ones." "I would treasure your letters," Ruby assured him, deeply touched by the request. They resumed walking along the creek bank, the silence between them now comfortable rather than strained. Ruby felt a quiet joy building within her, not the giddy excitement of a conventional courtship, but something deeper and more meaningful. Grant Remington was offering her not practiced gallantry or hasty passion, but something far more precious. The deliberate choice to emerge from isolation, to risk connection again after years of self-imposed solitude. As they turned back toward town, Grant spoke again. That first day when you asked if the church was ever locked and I questioned why, never did get a proper answer from you. Ruby laughed softly. I told you it was about my teaching materials. Don't believe that was the whole truth, Grant said, surprising her with his perception. Ruby considered her response, then decided on complete honesty. You're right. The question came to me because I was thinking about how different Silver Creek is from Boston. There, everything of value is locked away, protected behind barriers, but here, she gestured around them, here there's an openness, a trust that seemed foreign to me. The church standing unlocked was a symbol of that difference. Grant nodded slowly. And what did you make of my answer, that it's not locks that keep people honest out here? I thought it revealed something important about you, Ruby admitted. That despite your preference for solitude, you understand and value the community's unspoken agreements. That you believe in people's basic goodness, even if you keep your distance from them. Grant looked startled, then thoughtful. Never considered it that way, but might be some truth in it. They had reached the edge of town, where they would soon be visible to Sunday strollers and porch sitters. Grant paused, seeming reluctant to re-enter the public eye after their private conversation. Would like to walk you all the way back, he said, but not sure I'm ready for the attention that would bring. Ruby understood immediately. This has been a significant step for you already. We needn't rush what comes next. Relief and gratitude flickered in his eyes. Next Sunday then, same time. I'll look forward to it, Ruby confirmed, and to your letter should you choose to write. Grant took her gloved hand briefly, the gesture formal yet infused with genuine feeling. Thank you for understanding, for not giving up. Some people are worth not giving up on, Ruby repeated her words from the night in the church. Safe ride back to the ranch. As she watched him walk away, his tall figure moving with that characteristic purposeful stride, Ruby felt a certainty growing within her that something precious and rare was beginning between them. A connection built not on convenience or convention, but on genuine understanding and shared resilience. The winter weeks passed in a rhythm that brought increasing joy to Ruby's life. True to his word, Grant attended church each Sunday, and their walks afterward became the highlight of her week. Sometimes they strolled along the creek, sometimes through the quieter streets of town, but always their conversation flowed more easily than either might have predicted. And the letters, those were an unexpected treasure. Grant's written words revealed a thoughtful, observant mind and occasionally a dry humor that rarely surfaced in his speech. He wrote about the daily life of the ranch, observations about nature, and gradually, carefully, memories of his life before Silver Creek. Ruby responded with equal openness, sharing stories of her Boston upbringing, her father's rise and fall in business, and her own journey toward accepting the changes in her life. By Christmas, their developing relationship had become a subject of general knowledge in Silver Creek. Mrs. Wilson had progressed from subtle inquiries to outright questions about intentions, while Ruby's students occasionally giggled when Mr. Remington was mentioned. Ruby bore the attention with good humor, recognizing it as the natural interest of a small community rather than the malicious gossip she had experienced in Boston. Grant struggled more with the public nature of their connection, but persevered nonetheless. He began joining Ruby for occasional meals at the hotel restaurant and even attended the Christmas pageant where several of her students performed. These social appearances, though clearly demanding effort on his part, demonstrated a commitment to change that touched Ruby deeply. During their Christmas Eve walk, with snow falling gently around them, Grant had given her a small carved wooden box he had made himself. Not much of a gift compared to what you're probably used to, he'd said gruffly as she opened it. Inside, Ruby found a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a book, with a tiny key attached. The symbolism wasn't lost on her, the locked book representing both her teaching and their first meaningful conversation. It's perfect, she'd whispered, deeply moved by the thoughtfulness behind the gift. Will you help me put it on? The feeling of his fingers brushing the nape of her neck, as he fastened the clasp, had sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the December chill. By February, their Sunday walks had expanded to include dinner afterward at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, where Grant endured the landlady's not-so-subtle matchmaking with stoic patience. And in mid-March, when the first crocuses began pushing through the melting snow, Grant formally asked Ruby if he might court her with the intention of marriage. "Don't want to rush you," he'd said as they stood beside the newly thawed creek. "No, I'm not the kind of man you likely imagined for yourself, but these months with you have been. I can't go back to how I was living before, don't want to." Ruby had taken both his hands in hers, her heart full to bursting. "You are exactly the man I want, Grant Remington, not despite your struggles but because of how you faced them. Yes, I accept your courtship, and whatever it may lead to." He had kissed her then for the first time, a gentle, almost reverent touch of lips that spoke more eloquently than words about his feelings. Ruby had responded with equal tenderness, understanding that this step, like every other in their relationship, represented a significant victory over the isolation he had imposed upon himself for so long. As spring turned definitively to summer, Silver Creek buzzed with speculation about when an engagement might be announced. The schoolhouse had been completed at last, providing Ruby with a proper teaching environment and coincidentally removing one of the last tangible connections to their first meetings. In late June, nearly a year after Ruby's arrival in Silver Creek, Grant invited her to ride out to Carson Ranch one Sunday afternoon following church. "Old Carson wants to show you the new foals," he explained, though something in his manner suggested there was more to the invitation. Ruby agreed readily, having developed a genuine fondness for the gruff old rancher who had, in his own way, encouraged Grant to open himself to possibilities beyond solitary work. The ranch was at its most beautiful in early summer, with wildflowers dotting the surrounding meadows and new life evident everywhere from the foals frolicking in the corrals to the calves shadowing their mothers in the pastures. After greeting Carson and admiring the new horses, Grant suggested they ride to his favorite spot on the property. "If you're not too tired," he added, showing the consideration that had become increasingly natural to him over the months of their courtship. "I'd love to see it," Ruby assured him, comfortable now on horseback after many lessons from Grant throughout their courtship. He led her to a gentle rise overlooking a bend in the creek that gave the town its name. Here, away from the ranch buildings but with a view of distant mountains, a small cabin stood in a grove of pines. "My place," Grant explained as they dismounted. "Carson let me build it my second year here. Wanted something apart from the bunkhouse." Ruby looked at the cabin with interest. It was modest but well constructed, with a small porch and neatly stacked woodpile. Like Grant himself, it was unassuming but solid, built to withstand whatever the Montana elements might bring. "It suits you," she observed, "though it looks rather solitary." "It was," Grant agreed, taking her hand. "That was the point when I built it." He led her to the porch, gesturing for her to sit on a bench that overlooked the valley. "But I've been thinking it doesn't have to stay that way." Ruby's heart quickened as she began to understand the purpose behind this visit. Grant remained standing, his expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability that she had come to cherish. "When I came to Silver Creek, I thought I was done with family, with connection," he said, the words coming more easily than they once had. "Built this place to be alone with my grief and guilt over not saving Ellie." He took a deep breath. "But then you asked if the church was ever locked, and somehow that simple question started unlocking things in me that had been shut up tight for years." Ruby remained silent, allowing him this moment he had clearly rehearsed. "You showed me that safety isn't found in isolation but in trust, in taking the risk to care again." Grant knelt before her, taking both her hands in his. "Ruby Vance, I love you. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of making this solitary cabin a home?" Tears of happiness sprang to Ruby's eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "with all my heart, yes." Grant's face transformed with a smile of such unguarded joy that Ruby felt her breath catch. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring. "Belonged to my mother," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "Ellie kept it for me, said someday I'd find someone worthy of wearing it." "I'm honored," Ruby said softly, overwhelmed by the significance of the gesture. "I'll treasure it always." Grant drew her to her feet and into his arms, kissing her with a newfound confidence that spoke of the journey they had traveled together, from guarded strangers to people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of both strengths and wounds. When they returned to the main ranch house to share their news, Carson merely nodded with satisfaction. "About time," he grunted, though his eyes twinkled with genuine pleasure. Was beginning to think you'd never get around to it, Remington. Some things are worth taking time to be sure about, Grant replied, his arm around Ruby's waist in a public display of affection that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Their wedding took place in Silver Creek's church on a perfect September day, exactly 1 year after the school visit that had marked the beginning of their deeper connection. The building was filled to capacity with townspeople, ranch hands, and Ruby's students past and present. As they spoke their vows before Reverend Barnes, Ruby wore the silver book pendant Grant had given her at Christmas, a tangible reminder of the question that had started their journey together. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the light in Grant's eyes as he looked at her contained not just love but profound gratitude for the persistent schoolteacher who had seen beyond his defenses to the man beneath. The celebration afterward combined the best of frontier hospitality with touches of Eastern refinement that Mrs. Wilson and other town matrons insisted upon for their teacher's special day. Grant navigated the social gathering with newfound ease, his quiet nature now reading as strength rather than aloofness. Late in the evening, as lanterns illuminated the dance floor set up in the town square, Carson approached the couple with a weathered envelope. "Wedding gift," he announced gruffly. "Been considering retirement for a while now, too old to run the whole operation myself anymore." Grant opened the envelope to find papers transferring a significant portion of Carson Ranch to his name. "Carson, this is too much," he protested. The old rancher shook his head. "You've earned it, son, been running the place in all but name for the past year anyway. Figure with a wife and eventually a family, you'll need something more substantial than foreman's wages." His eyes twinkled. "Besides, the cabin you built is on that parcel. Consider it my investment in Silver Creek's future." As Carson walked away to avoid any emotional response to his generosity, Ruby squeezed her husband's hand. "He thinks of you as a son," she said softly. "Has for some time, I suspect." Grant nodded, visibly moved. "Never thought I'd have family again after Ellie. Now I have you, Carson. Maybe someday children of our own." "Life has a way of surprising us," Ruby agreed, "especially when we're brave enough to leave doors unlocked." Grant smiled at the reference. "Speaking of which," he said, taking her hand, "what do you say we slip away from our own celebration? I believe my wife and I have a cabin waiting for us." As they made their quiet departure, unnoticed in the continuing festivities, Ruby reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter outside the general store to a blizzard night in the church to this perfect September evening, each step had been part of a path neither could have imagined when they first met. The cabin that had once stood as a monument to Grant's isolation now welcomed them with warm lamplight as they approached on horseback. He lifted her from the saddle with strong, gentle hands and carried her across the threshold into their home. Inside, Ruby saw how he had prepared for her arrival: fresh curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the bed, her books arranged on newly built shelves. What had been a functional shelter was now ready to become a home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Remington," Grant said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. Ruby reached up to touch his face, marveling at how this once reserved man now looked at her with such open adoration. "It's perfect," she whispered, "everything I could have wished for." Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, the sound of the creek drifting through the partially open window, Grant pressed a kiss to her temple. "Thank you," he murmured. "For what?" Ruby asked, nestled contentedly against his side. "For asking if the church was ever locked," he said simply. "For making me question why I'd locked away my own heart." Ruby smiled in the darkness, her hand resting over his steadily beating heart. "And thank you for answering honestly, for being brave enough to unlock it again." As they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, the cabin that had once stood as a testament to solitude became what it was always meant to be: a sanctuary shared, a promise of connection that would weather whatever storms the frontier might bring, stronger together than either could ever have been alone.